I was running, and it didn't matter which way I turned. Every hallway led back to him. He came around the corner ahead of me before I even heard him move, and there was nowhere left to go. He was close enough to reach me in one more step. This didn't start that night. It started 2 years earlier, the first time I watched him put that suit on. And God help me, some nights I still wish I could go back and stop myself from ever walking into that dressing room. My cousin got me the job. He did lighting for one of the smaller studios outside Tokyo. It was spring of 1954. They needed extra hands for a monster picture nobody on the crew took seriously yet. A giant lizard, woken by a nuclear test, flattening Tokyo one street at a time. I ran cable, moved lighting rigs, translated for the American technicians the studio had flown in to help with the effects work. And for about a week, it felt like the easiest money I would ever make in my life. By my second day, something about the production felt wrong, and I couldn't shake it no matter how hard I tried. The man inside the monster suit wasn't on any casting sheet. Nobody could tell me where he'd come from, or why 3 other actors had already quit the role within a day each, and when I asked, people looked away instead of answering me. So I did what anyone curious enough would do. I went looking for him myself. He pulled the head of the suit off when I knocked, sweat running down a face that looked tired but kind, maybe 30 years old, and he smiled at me like he was relieved to see another human being standing in that doorway. He gave me a name I won't repeat here, because by the end of this story, it stopped being his. He preferred what he'd started calling the suit itself, Goji, short for Gojira. He said it the way a man says a nickname his wife gave him, fond and a little embarrassed. And I remember thinking he seemed far too gentle for a job that chewed through actors this fast. We were friends within a month, the fast, easy kind you make on a set that runs long hours. He shared a rice his mother packed him. He did an impression of the director that made the director laugh so hard he had to leave the room. I liked him more than I liked almost anyone else on that lot, and some nights I still hear that laugh in my sleep. Hold on to that. It's the only thing that's going to make sense of what I watched him become. 6 weeks in, we filmed a scene where Goji had to stand at the edge of a miniature set while the water team flooded the tank around his feet. The pose called for 10 seconds of stillness. He was still standing an hour later, and by then, I could hear that his breathing had changed. From the ordinary, heavy breathing of a man baking inside 30 pounds of rubber, to something slower and wetter, like every breath had to fight its way through something that hadn't been in his chest that morning. Nobody called cut. I stood there with a coil of cable in my hands, telling myself it was heat, telling myself anything at all, because the truth didn't have a shape I was ready to hold yet. 2 assistants worked the zipper down his back while I held the tent flap open, my own pulse loud enough that I could feel it in my ears. It caught almost immediately, and when one of them pulled harder, Goji made a sound I had never heard a human being make before or since. High, thin, tearing, like something ripping that was never built to rip. The assistant let go so fast you'd think the zipper had burned him, and I felt my stomach drop straight through the floor of that tent. We got it open an inch at a time, and the smell hit us before anything else did. Hot and sweet and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. What was underneath wasn't a man who needed water and a dark room. It was skin that had become the suit, stretched taut and shining over a ribcage gone subtly, sickeningly wide, wet seams of blood tracing every place rubber had fused to flesh. I gagged before I could stop myself. 2 of the crew were sick right there in the tent, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking for the rest of that day. Nobody took a photograph. Nobody wanted proof that any of us had seen it. I went to find him that night, in the small room they'd built near the costume department, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my throat with every step down that hallway. He was sitting on the edge of a cot, still half in the suit, because taking off the rest of it had become its own kind of surgery. And for one long moment, when he looked up at me, I saw him again, the man who shared his rice. Then he opened his mouth to say something, and what came out was a low, rattling sound from somewhere far deeper in his chest than a voice should ever come from, and I had to grip the doorframe just to stay on my feet. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself a lot of things that spring, because the alternative was standing in that doorway, and admitting my friend was already gone. The first picture made the studio more money than anyone predicted, and inside a year we were shooting a sequel, this one built around a second monster, a spiked, 4-legged creature called Anguirus. By then, Goji hadn't spoken a real word in almost a year, and some nights I lay awake trying to remember the exact sound of his voice before I lost it for good. He only answered to the name we'd given the suit, and even that came out as a grunt. The man cast as Anguirus was a stunt performer named Sato. I liked him. He was uneasy around Goji from his first day on set, in a way nobody had told him to be, because nobody had told him anything. The final fight was supposed to end with a scripted bite, Godzilla's jaw closing on Anguirus' shoulder, rehearsed for weeks with a padded, harmless version of the suit's teeth. What happened on the day of filming had nothing rehearsed about it. Goji's jaw closed on Sato's shoulder. It closed on his head, and it didn't stop at the padding. I was 30 feet away with a cable spool in my hands when Sato started screaming, and it wasn't the sound of a man performing pain. It cracked halfway through, wet and ragged, and underneath it I could hear something worse, a low, satisfied grunt coming from Goji's throat, like the sound a starving man makes at the smell of food. My stomach turned over before my legs remembered how to run, and by the time I reached them, I was already shouting for someone, anyone, to pull him off. By the time 3 of the largest men on the crew tore the suits apart, Sato had gone silent in a way that scared me far more than the screaming had. They had to cut his costume off him with tools, and where Goji's teeth had broken the seal, I watched his skin start doing exactly what Goji's had done 6 weeks into the first picture, bubbling, reshaping itself around the wound like something underneath it was already deciding what to become next. I threw up behind the equipment tent. I wasn't the only one, and my hands were still shaking an hour later when they finally let us all go home. Sato didn't die that day, though it would have been kinder if he had. He stopped being a man in the same slow, wrong way Goji had, and the studio moved him into a room 2 doors down and told the rest of the crew he'd suffered a private injury and was recovering off-set. I hated them for that lie more than I had ever hated anyone in my life, and I said nothing because I was afraid, and I was being paid. and I have never once forgiven myself for how easily those two things kept my mouth shut. Around then, the studio signed onto a joint production with an American company, pitting Godzilla against a giant ape for an international crossover, shot partly on a coastline outside the city. They put me on it because I could translate between the Japanese crew and the American technicians who'd flown in with their own equipment and their own actor in the ape suit, a big, easygoing man named Frank, who spent his evenings trying to teach half the crew card games in his hotel room. Frank didn't know what Goji was. The studio had made sure of that. Fewer people who knew meant fewer people who could talk, and I hated myself a little more every day I stayed quiet around him. The climactic fight was staged on a cliff above open water. The two creatures meant to grapple near the edge before the ape went over into the sea, caught by safety divers stationed just out of frame. I was running a handheld camera on a secondary angle, close enough to hear both men breathing inside their suits, and close enough that some animal part of me already wanted to call out and stop the whole thing before it started. Goji didn't let go when the scene called for him to let go. Frank must have felt it in the half-second his weight shifted wrong, because a sound came through the speaker grill of his suit before the two of them went over the edge together, and it cut off hard when the water took it. Through the viewfinder, the fall looked almost graceful. What came after didn't. My hands were shaking so hard on the camera grip I nearly dropped it, and some small, useless part of me kept thinking that if I just held it steady, none of this could actually be happening. The surface boiled white for a moment, then dark, then white again, and I kept the camera rolling because I had been told, specifically, not to stop no matter what happened on film, and some small, cowardly part of me was grateful for an order that let me stop deciding anything for myself. The water kept turning over on itself, longer than any two men wrestling should have needed. The divers went in fast. Only one came back up, moving, and he came up gagging, clawing at his own mask like whatever he'd touched down there might still be on it, and he would not go back under, no matter what the boat crew screamed at him. It took 4 more divers and the better part of 10 minutes to bring up what was left of the ape suit, and by the time they did, the water around all of it had turned a color. No clean ocean turns, spreading out slow and wide in the current until 2 of the crew on deck had to turn away and be sick over the rail. Frank's family got told he had drowned in a stunt accident. I sat in the room where that lie was written down, my hands still not quite steady, and I said nothing that day either. By the 4th picture, the studio had started keeping 2 spare suits in storage for every production, in case Goji did to a costume what he had already done to 3 of them. Nobody said out loud why. Everybody understood anyway. This one was built around a pair of giant pteranodons the crew called Rodon, twin creatures meant to tear through a city from the air. Since nothing about Goji could fly, the studio kept him mostly off that sound stage, and for the first time in 2 pictures, I let myself believe we had finally found a way to make one of these movies without anyone getting hurt. I was wrong within a week. The actor cast as one of the Rodon twins was a quiet man named Ishida, older than the rest of us, a father of 2 who had taken the job because the pay was better than anything else on offer that year. He was not scheduled anywhere near Goji's unit. Nobody had a reason to think their paths would ever cross. They crossed anyway, because somebody in scheduling put both units on the same soundstage the same afternoon to save money on rented cranes, and by the time anyone above us noticed, Ishida was already in costume, already rehearsing his blocking 20 feet from where Goji stood waiting for his own call time. I watched it happen from the catwalk above, closer to the lights than I had any business being that day. Goji did not cross the floor the way he had with Sato, fast and certain. He watched Ishida for a long time first, head tilted, the way he had started tilting it at everything by then, like some part of him was always listening for a sound the rest of us couldn't hear. Then he walked over, slow, almost polite, and set one hand on Ishida's shoulder, the way you would greet an old friend. Ishida turned to see who had touched him, and whatever he saw underneath that mask made him go rigid before he managed a single sound. I have never been able to explain what happened next to anyone who asked, because there was not a mark on Ishida afterward, not one cut, not one bruise. He simply stopped being able to stand under his own power. And when the crew finally got his headpiece off, his eyes had gone the same flat, glassy white I had already started seeing in Goji's eyes on his worst nights. He never spoke again in any language anyone recognized. The studio called it a stroke, filed the paperwork, and quietly paid his wife more money than they paid anyone else that year to sign something none of us were ever allowed to read. I don't know what Goji did to him. I only know it did not need teeth to do it. That was the first time I understood he could take a person apart without ever laying a hand on them wrong. And once I understood that, every quiet moment on that lot turned into something I had to survive, rather than something I got to enjoy. I started flinching at doorways. I started counting exits in every room I walked into, the way you count something once you have stopped trusting the walls to keep you safe. Nobody made me keep working there. I could have quit, and I told myself that every night for 2 years straight, and every morning I put my uniform back on and walked through those same gates anyway. Because the money was good, because I did not know what else a man like me was supposed to do in that city, and because some small, stupid, loyal part of me still could not leave him. Not yet. Not while some sliver of the man who used to share his rice might still be in there somewhere, waiting for someone to notice him. By the next picture, built around a giant moth called Mothra, the studio had learned enough, at least on paper, to build the new creature almost entirely as a puppet, so no one would need to stand inside a suit across from Goji again. Almost entirely. The larvae needed a specific crawling motion no puppet could manage in close-up, and for those shots the studio hired a young woman, barely into her 20s, to wear a padded costume and perform the movement herself. Her name was Aiko. I met her once, the morning of her first day, carrying a lighting stand past the spot where she waited with her parents, who had come to watch her work. Her father asked me, cheerful and proud, whether the monster looked as impressive up close as it did on screen. I told him it was something like that, and my hands were sweating just standing near him, knowing what I knew, and saying nothing. I have thought about that lie more than almost any other I told that year. Goji wasn't supposed to touch her at all. I was close enough to the video monitor to watch him go still the way he always did right before deciding to move, and my whole body went cold a full second before he did. Then he crossed the distance faster than I had ever seen him move in a suit that heavy. His jaw closed on her shoulder before she had even finished turning toward the sound of him, and I watched the padding split and the fabric underneath go dark and wet inside the space of a single frame. She didn't scream, not at first. The only sound out of her was air, thin and constant, like whatever had just happened to her body hadn't reached whatever part of a person decides to scream yet. Her parents were over the barrier and running before anyone could stop them. And I understand exactly why, because I would have done the same thing in their place. I couldn't move. I just stood there behind that monitor, useless, screaming for someone to do something, while Goji turned on them the second they got close. By the time 4 grown men pulled him off, neither one of them was getting up again, and the sound Aiko made from inside that costume, watching it happen, was not a sound I have ever heard a person make since. High, constant, no words anywhere in it. It is the sound I still hear some nights when the room is too quiet. He didn't leave her afterward. He crouched over her instead, low and still, the way you'd guard something you'd claimed rather than something you'd hurt, and it took cattle prods to drive him off her at all. He ran into the tree line, the first time in almost 2 years he had been outside a controlled set, and it took a search team the better part of an hour to find him again, standing in a small clearing, swaying on his feet. The smell reached them before their torches did, the same smell I'd first caught in that tent 6 weeks into the first picture, except thicker now, worse, like it had had 2 years to get stronger. He doubled over and vomited a thick, dark red fluid onto the ground, hot enough that steam came off it in the cool evening air. Nobody said out loud what we were all thinking. Whatever that was, it wasn't blood a living man should still have in him. They tased him until he dropped and carried him back inside. Aiko lived. That's the one mercy in this story. She lived, and over the following weeks, in the same room where Sato and Goji had both changed before her, I heard the same tearing wet sounds through the wall some nights, caught the same sweet, rotten smell under the door some mornings, and her body began the same slow, wrong transformation. The last time I saw her face before they moved her in there for good, she wore an expression I recognized instantly, because I had worn it myself every day since the spring before. Someone who understood completely that nobody was coming to save her. I have never told anyone how much that look wrecked me until right now. After that night, the studio watched me differently. I had asked too many questions and spent too much time near rooms I wasn't assigned to. A senior producer pulled me aside, calm as anything, and reminded me my contract could end whenever they wanted it to, for any reason they liked, and that a man with no studio job in that city had very few good options left. I understood him without him needing to say any more than that. I stopped asking questions out loud. I never once stopped asking them in my head, and I hated myself a little more every single day that I didn't. After Aiko, the studio stopped announcing new pictures for a while. Officially, the executives called it a change in strategy, a chance to focus on distribution instead of production. Unofficially, I think even they had run out of ways to explain the disappearances to families, to insurance adjusters, to the handful of journalists who had started quietly asking why so many young performers left that lot and never worked in this industry again. I spent those months doing whatever odd work they handed me, mostly maintenance on equipment nobody used anymore, and I saw Goji only twice, both times through the reinforced observation window of the room they kept him in whenever there was no picture running. He did not do anything on either occasion. He simply stood in the center of that room, facing the door, like he already knew exactly when I would be on the other side of that glass before I knew it myself. The second time, he raised one hand and pressed it flat against the window, slow and deliberate, and held it there until a guard finally pulled me away by the arm. I did not sleep that night. I kept thinking about how precisely he had known where to put his hand, right where my own hand landed on the glass a half-second later, like he had been waiting there specifically for me to reach for him. I asked for a transfer twice that year. Both requests came back denied within a day, no explanation attached. And the second time, the same senior producer who had warned me once before found an excuse to walk past my station and mention, almost gently, that men who asked too many questions about that soundstage had a way of becoming difficult to employ anywhere in this industry ever again. I understood him. I always understood him. I stopped asking for anything after that, and I told myself the fear I felt every time I walked past that observation window was just professional caution. It was not caution. I know that now. It was the first time I let myself admit, even privately, that whatever was happening in that room had started keeping track of me, specifically, the way you keep track of someone you intend to finish something with. I stopped writing home that year. My mother wrote twice asking why, and both times I told her the studio kept me too busy, which was true in the way lies are often technically true. What I could not tell her was that I had started rehearsing conversations with people who no longer had faces, standing alone in my room, running through apologies I would never get to give Sato or Frank's widow or Aiko's parents, because saying any of it out loud to someone who could actually hear me felt like a door I was not allowed to open. I lost weight that year too, though I did not notice until a costume fitting for an unrelated scene revealed my own uniform no longer fit. And even then, I told myself, it was the heat. By the time the studio finally greenlit a new picture, I had stopped believing any version of this story ended with me simply walking away from it. I kept showing up anyway. That, more than anything else, might be the part of all this I understand least, even now. What the studio greenlit next was not a monster picture at all. Not at first. It was something quieter, something they did not advertise on any call sheet, and it frightened me more than anything Goji had done since the day I met him. Word came down through the assistant directors before it ever reached the rest of us officially. The studio had quietly begun training a second performer to eventually take over the Godzilla role entirely, in case Goji ever became too unstable or too visible to keep using in front of a camera. They called him an understudy, the same word you would use for a stage play, as if that made any of it sound less like what it actually was. His name was Kondo, a younger man. Ambitious in the ordinary way ambitious young men are, hungry for a leading role in anything, even a role that meant spending 12 hours a day sealed inside 30 pounds of rubber. Nobody told him what had happened to Sato. Nobody told him about Ishida or about the room with the reinforced window. As far as Kondo knew, he had simply been handed the opportunity of his career, They kept him and Goji apart for the first 2 weeks of training, running Kondo through his blocking on an empty soundstage, while Goji stayed contained on the far side of the lot. I told myself that arrangement would hold. I had told myself things like that before. It held for exactly 14 days. On the 15th, a supervisor decided Kondo needed to study Goji's movement directly to get the performance right, and had him brought onto the observation platform above the containment room, close enough to watch through the reinforced glass, close enough, I understood only afterward, for Goji to watch him back. I was not on that platform when it happened, and for that I have spent years being grateful in a way I am not proud of. What I know secondhand, from 2 guards who quit within a month and never spoke about it again, to anyone still working there. Kondo stood at that window for 11 minutes, they said, simply looking, the way you would study anyone you admired. On the 12th minute, Goji pressed his hand flat against the glass exactly the way he had with me, and Kondo pressed his own hand against the other side to match it. Delighted, the guards said, like a child meeting someone he had only ever seen in pictures. Kondo never spoke a coherent sentence again after that afternoon. Physically, he was unmarked, same as Ishida had been, but something behind his eyes had gone quiet in a way that made the guards refuse to work that shift again. The studio moved him into a room 2 floors below the one where Sato had gone, and 2 floors below the one where Aiko still was by then, and told his family he had suffered a nervous collapse from the pressure of the role. I understood, finally and completely, what all of this had actually been about. It was never really a monster picture. It had become a machine for finding out how many people a lot in that city was willing to feed to something they had built themselves and no longer knew how to stop. And I was one of the very few people left standing close enough to watch every single feeding and still be expected to show up for work the next morning. The last picture I worked on there featured a monster unlike any of the others, a 3-headed creature the crew called Ghidorah, built as a suit worn by a single performer, instead of the 3 the design technically called for. Nobody wanted to risk more than 1 person in a costume anywhere near Goji again. They had redesigned his containment by then, too. Guards moved him between takes. The newer suits came reinforced with a thicker shell, so his teeth couldn't puncture them the way they had with Sato and Aiko. They kept me on because I was useful and quiet, and I think because somebody in management had decided a frightened employee made a safer employee than an angry one. They were right about the fear. They were wrong about what it would make me do. The final scene called for Goji to hold still for an extended beat before the 2 creatures collided. On the 4th night of shooting that sequence, in the middle of that stillness, every light on the soundstage went out at once, and my heart was already hammering before I understood why. Nobody had touched the breaker panel, which sat absurdly along the back wall of that same stage, close enough to Goji's mark that I have never once decided whether what happened next was an accident. In the dark, with a crew shouting for a torch, I heard that same wet, rattling breath I had first heard 6 weeks into the very first picture, except now it was moving, fast, straight toward the part of the stage where the equipment carts and I were standing. I dropped what I was holding and ran. No plan, no direction, just away. Every animal part of me understood before the rest of me caught up. that whatever Goji had become that night had decided, for reasons I will never know, that I was the one it wanted. I made it off the main stage and into the corridor that led toward the prop storage rooms. The same corridor, the same rooms. This whole story has been walking toward since the first word out of my mouth. I could hear him behind me, closer with every second, moving with a speed no man in 30 pounds of rubber should have been capable of. And I remember thinking, absurdly, that I had never once in 2 years heard him move that fast. Every hallway I turned into led back to him. I doubled back once, then again, and each time he was closer than before, until there was only one corridor left to try. I was running, and it didn't matter which way I turned. Every hallway led back to him. He came around the corner ahead of me before I even heard him move, and there was nowhere left to go. He was close enough to reach me in one more step. I could have kept running toward nothing. Part of me still thinks I should have. But there was no more hallway left to disappear into, and some part of me needed this more than it needed to survive it. Was this what you wanted? The words tore out of me before I decided to say them, cracked and too loud for that corridor, my hands up in front of me, like they could actually stop 30 pounds of rubber and whatever was underneath it. And for one impossible second, he stopped. He filled the corridor in front of me, backlit by the one working bulb still burning behind him, close enough now that I could smell him. And for the first time in almost a year, I let myself really look at what was left of the man who used to share his rice and did an impression of the director that made everyone laugh. My voice cracked on his name. Goji. He tilted his head at the sound of it, the way a dog tilts its head at a word it almost remembers. You used to laugh at your own jokes before anyone else did. My voice was shaking, and I let it shake because I was done pretending it wasn't. You gave your rice away because you said your mother packed too much on purpose so you'd have an excuse to share it. You were the kindest man on that whole set, and I watched them turn you into this, one film at a time, and I never did a single thing to stop it. He didn't move. His breathing was the only sound in the corridor. Did you want this? My voice dropped, and I hated how small it sounded after all that yelling. Any part of it, the strength, the way they were all afraid of you by the end. Was there some version of you left in there that liked what you became? Do you remember any of them? The question came out quieter than I meant it to, almost gentle, the way you ask something you are afraid to actually hear answered. Sato, Frank, Ishida, the girl in the moth costume, Kondo. Do you carry any of them in there with you, or did they just disappear the second you finished with them? For 1 second, something changed behind his eyes. I have spent years since trying to name what that change actually was. Recognition, maybe, or hunger. I still don't know, and I have stopped expecting that I ever will. His head tilted the other way, his mouth opened, slow, like he was about to answer me, or scream, or do something else I never got to find out.